This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam's tech sector is in the midst of a challenging stretch, though it's far from alone. A global funding winter, spurred in part by high interest rates in major markets, persists, though some relief may be on the horizon, with the United States expected to cut interest rates later this year. Here in Southeast Asia, total tech funding fell 29% year on year in the first quarter of this year, with regional startups drawing $1.2 billion in funding. That's a massive 82.6% drop from the first quarter of 2022. So that gives you a sense of how things have changed over the last couple of years. Through the first half of this year, Vietnam's tech startups drew $46.5 million in funding, down 52.7% compared to the first 6 months of 2023. This is according to Traction, the data intelligence and market research firm. One of the country's biggest tech stories this year is an event that didn't happen. VNG, the tech unicorn behind the ubiquitous messaging platform Zalo and several other products, decided to postpone its planned IPO, or initial public offering, in the United States. A unicorn, by the way, is a startup valued at least $1 billion, and Vietnam has four: VNG, Momo, VNPay, and Sky Mavis. But as you'll hear in this episode, the worst may be over. A sentiment shared by Traction in their recent update on the tech industry, which noted, quote, "Despite the funding challenges, Vietnam's tech startup ecosystem continues to exhibit resilience, driven by strong performances in key sectors and strategic regional investments," end quote. Today's guest is Eddie Tai, co-founder and general partner of Ascend Ventures Vietnam, or AVV. Few people here have more tech funding experience than Eddie, and he's been a great source of insight over the years. We discussed the state of tech funding here in the context of the funding winter, the country's tech strengths and weaknesses, what Eddie looks for when deciding to invest, Vietnam's nascent AI industry and the rising importance of sovereign AI. He explains what that means. His wish to see Vietnamese founders aim bigger and understand the hypercompetitive nature of their fields, and his outlook for the sector. You'll also find out how many people with the last name Nguyen work at the Magnificent Seven tech companies in the US, meaning Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Tesla, and Apple. The answer definitely surprised me. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Eddie. Eddie, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So we'll just go ahead and jump right in. I saw recently, I'm sure there's different statistics in different places, but that tech investment or funding for Vietnam's tech startups fell significantly in the first half of this year, and that's coming off of the so-called global funding winter of 2023. So what have you seen, or what do you make of the overall tech funding scene here at the moment?
Yeah, I'd say things are down versus where they were a few years ago. That's kind of in keeping with what you've probably seen as well about when Vietnam sees trends that the rest of the world sees. So like the global financial crisis back in 2008, with the property market collapse in the US, Vietnam only saw its collapses a couple of years later. I think similarly for the venture scene recently, the US VC winter hit starting a couple of years ago, and Vietnam saw the effects of that downstream starting 12 to 18 months. I would say that we've probably hit bottom. When will things recover to the heydays of a few years ago? TBD. But we're definitely seeing more activity now than we were seeing 12 months ago, let's say. And a lot of that activity is focused on the seed stage. So what gets the headlines and obviously what drives dollar volume are growth stage financings, and those are still lagging. But the seed stage is quite busy now.
Okay. And just for listeners who may not be super familiar, what's kind of the distinction between seed stage and growth stage?
Yeah. So seed stage investments are typically they're often in companies that just have an idea, don't really have a product yet. Or they may have a product with some revenue, but certainly no profitability yet. Growth stage, usually product market fit has been demonstrated, and they're raising, say, tens of millions of dollars or even a few $100 million to finish their journey to hopefully multi-billion-dollar outcome.
So I mean, what are some of the strong points of Vietnam's tech startup scene at the moment?
The strong points for Vietnam, I think, are as they have been for several years now. First, strong local market from which to begin building companies. It's nice to be able to build for a large, populous, fast-growing economy, a young population that's digitally savvy, and so on. Second is the low-cost, high-tech talent in particular. Vietnam's been an outsourcing destination for a few decades now, but quietly so until recently. Now, more companies around the world recognize the talent that exists here and have been setting up, have been partnering with outsourcing companies or even setting up their own development teams here. Still, engineering compensation here is substantially lower than, of course, San Francisco, but even, say, second-tier hubs around the world. So that continues to be a strength. Third, so these first two things are very similar to other emerging markets. But I think what makes Vietnam stand above many of the rest is just how deeply connected it is to markets around the world and especially tech hubs around the world. Shortly before hopping on this session with you, I did a quick search on LinkedIn and found that there are, among the magnificent seven companies, so to speak, so Google, Meta, NVIDIA, Apple, and so on, there are more than 2,000 people currently working on at these companies with the last name of Nguyen in the U.S. alone.
What?
Yeah, 2,000.
That's kind of insane.
Yeah. And then, add another 500 for a Nguyen and so on and so forth. So there are many Vietnamese people working at these companies. This matters because they transfer knowledge, at least. They mentor. And in fact, many of them even come back to Vietnam either to work for companies here or to start their own companies here. I think that level of, say, penetration into the heart of global tech is not common from many other emerging populations around the world.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I mean, no free ads for any company names here, but I think like the founder of Datbike, I think came from Google or worked for Google at one point.
I believe so. And we've also backed a few of our, also a few of our portfolio companies have been founded by alumni of these companies.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, well, that's still kind of blowing my mind about the 2,000 Nguyen's. I mean, so those are some of the strong points. What are some weaknesses within Vietnam's tech sector?
Sure. Yeah, so I can count to several, but the key ones that jump to mind are one, that while Vietnam's a fast-growing market and a very populous market, the economy in dollar terms is still pretty small. So global investors who are more familiar with, say, developed markets like the U.S., of course, and larger emerging markets like China, India, and Indonesia, sometimes struggle to wrap their head around whether and how to invest in a smaller country like Vietnam. That's one. Two, while the tech scene has developed some very interesting companies, and in fact, 4 unicorns from recent valuations, exits are still limited. None of those 4 unicorns have exited, for example, and smaller scale exits are not frequent yet either. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is the local stock market is not yet well developed for tech IPOs, but more importantly, it's just a matter of to us an ecosystem stage kind of thing. Any ecosystem around the world, you got to start to walk before you run. If you look to China 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you might ask yourself, hey, where are the tech exits? Well, it was too early back then. You got to give them time to grow, right? So still, that's something. And until the exits start to increase, then I think both capital and labor will not flow as much here as they should, I think.
Sorry, I was going to say on a terminology point, what do you mean by an exit?
IPO or substantial acquisition.
Okay, gotcha.
And then I would say the third, so those are kind of external factors / timing factors, but I would say the third is, we would love to see the depth of senior level talent continue to build. There are phenomenal people here who have built companies that have been backed by the likes of Sequoia, Google, and Andreessen, and so on. But still, I would say pretty dispersed, the talent. It can be hard to assemble say, a world-class team readily. And I think that just, again, takes some time. People have to go through their journeys at whatever other company before they launch their own. There have been increasing infusions of talent in the meantime from, say, returnees or even pure foreigners who decide that Vietnam is an interesting place to get started.
And kind of, moving to Ascend Ventures a little bit more, what types of startups, investments, entrepreneurs do you like to focus on?
Yeah, so we're focused on great founders launching internationally iconic companies from Vietnam. So great founders, of course. I think any VC in the world will say, the founders are the number one criteria for success. The latter part of that is a little more unusual, I'd say. Many of the VCs regionally, when they look at Vietnam, and many of the local VCs, when they look at Vietnam, are trying to tap into opportunities to build companies for this fast-growing economy. Some call it a time machine model, even looking to say what happened in Indonesia or Korea or China, and understanding that Vietnam is following a trajectory similar to those countries, and so backing early companies there. Mm-hmm. And I think that will play out pretty well over the next decade or two. We still have a lot of demographic dividend to harvest, right? But I think that's just a fraction of the full opportunity. And I alluded to it earlier in our conversation, which is that Vietnam has great tech talent. Vietnam has great connectivity. There is an underappreciated opportunity to back these guys and gals who, working with what they have around here, getting started here in Vietnam, but then quickly going to international markets. And international could be in Southeast Asia, it could be among emerging markets, or it could even be global.
Yeah, are there any, beyond your portfolio, but are there any prominent examples of Vietnamese startups that have gone even regional? I guess it's a bit limited if I'm correct.
Yeah, it's I can't say in terms of population figures of how many companies, but from our very first investment, that exactly opened our eyes to this opportunity. It's a company called Elsa, which I think is often talked about. A Vietnamese woman, Stanford graduate, decided to solve a problem of her own, leveraging technology, which is English pronunciation, and now it's actually broader English training. We were early investors in that, and that within just a couple of years expanded from just serving Vietnam to serving people in virtually every country around the world. We have seen, Trusting Social, when it was a PhD in data analytics, basically worked for Barclays for a while, decided to come back to Vietnam and build something for the homeland, and ended up using his skills to build credit profiles for the unbanked and underbanked in Vietnam and other emerging markets in the region. That company quickly expanded to 4 countries across Southeast Asia. They were the first company in Vietnam backed by Sequoia, and so on. Axie Infinity is the third example I'll share. A lot of people are surprised to hear that this was actually a Vietnam-based team, but they blew open the Web3 gaming space. This guy who actually never studied or worked abroad, but got some time working with startups, both founding one and then working with another company that we backed, actually, realized there was an opportunity here, started building before most people knew what an NFT was. Within a few years, went from about $100,000 of revenue per month to, at its peak, $160 million of revenue per month. This is back in 2021.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, we've seen these examples, and it's not like every team who tries it succeeds. It's obviously quite challenging to build any startup, let alone a globally successful one. But we've seen it enough times to develop a perspective or a conviction that this is a steady state phenomenon and not just luck.
Do you have any, obviously within tech, there's many subsectors, fintech, health tech, climate tech, you name it. Do you have any kind of subsectors you focus on, or is your investment philosophy broad?
Yeah, we're generally opportunistic. So we're open to taking a look at most things, but we have developed theses over time. And those evolve over time as well, of course, as the world evolves. Early on, we were quite interested in fintech, education tech, future of work, enterprise SaaS, and some of our best companies from among our first 100 or so investments have been in those spaces. Now and probably for the next few years, we are, say, going to harder sectors like agriculture tech, manufacturing tech, and so on. Spaces where it's not like anybody on the street can start something up, but it requires a depth of passion for the space, a depth of understanding for the space, and so on. But spaces that are quite ripe for, say, innovation. Those spaces that I just mentioned happen also to be spaces of strength for Vietnam itself. So, and then in terms of, so those might seem obvious to folks, but I guess in the early years of Vietnam's ecosystem, there wasn't as much happening there of, say, venture scale and venture grade. But that's increasingly changing. We have made probably, of our last 20 investments, about 6 to 8 investments in those two spaces alone. But generalizing to, say, tech layers rather than sectors, AI, robotics, augmented reality. AI and robotics, that's probably predictable. There's given the hype that's happening right now. But already up till now, we have made about a quarter of our investments that have a major AI focus. And we expect that eventually people won't be calling companies AI companies anymore. But every company will be an AI company. It would be kind of like how nobody calls themselves an app company anymore.
Yeah.
So we want to continue to invest in AI and the talent pool around AI in Vietnam, or that is Vietnam connected, is growing and deepening. I think just a few years ago, there were maybe just a few hundred sophisticated AI engineers here. And now we estimate there are a few thousand, and we expect that to continue to grow rapidly. I'll pause there. I know a bunch of things there.
I mean, AI is, of course, as you mentioned, global hype. NVIDIA's like some days the most valuable company in the world now, due to that demand for their chips. Of course, the Vietnamese government talks about it a lot. I mean, out of curiosity, what kind of, of course, there's nothing quite as advanced as ChatGPT, I suppose, coming out of Vietnam quite yet. But what kind of solutions are you seeing being worked on in that space here?
Sure. So, to a degree, these LLM companies, these giant players like OpenAI, Google, and Meta are going to dominate the advancement of the biggest LLMs. But we think there's a lot of space for specialized models or small language models that work with a harder to access data set, for example, or that work with a more specific use case. You don't need to take a sledgehammer to every solution, no, to every problem, excuse me. Mm-hmm. So there's that. Mm-hmm. We also believe there are opportunities around sovereign AI as a theme. So does every individual, every company, every government want to subject themselves to being beholden to these US-based companies? And the risks that entails, whether it's geopolitics or physical disconnections. We know how often people here in Vietnam talk about the undersea cables being bitten by sharks.
Yeah.
So the notion of solutions that can work with less power, less hardware, even on your own devices, in a way that protects your privacy of your data and the ownership of your use of the tool. I think that's going to be a major theme. And we're already seeing and backing some companies like that as well.
So you've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs over the years. I'm obviously not asking you to throw anyone under the bus, but what do you hope to see more of, or would you hope to see more of from tech entrepreneurs in Vietnam?
Sure. I think two main things. One is I wish more Vietnamese entrepreneurs would aim bigger. I think many entrepreneurs here are building businesses that can be $10 million companies or even $100 million companies, and nothing wrong with that. Those would be life-changing for them, serve a lot of customers and so on as well. But I think that is not harnessing the full potential of some of these entrepreneurs to build $1 billion companies or $10 billion. And so having a belief in oneself to aim higher and to understand what that requires is something that more entrepreneurs here could have. Their potential is much greater than they know. So that's one. Two, I wish Vietnamese entrepreneurs understood a little more clearly how they're playing in hyper-competitive spaces. Whether they are whether they are building companies just for the Vietnam market or building for international markets. Even if they're building for just local markets, they have to expect the competition is going to be fierce. Companies are being built and expanding faster than ever before. Innovation's happening fast. Resources can shift quickly. And so being first mover or having the lowest price or having a single good connection or multiple good connections with certain stakeholders, these might give you a head start, but they are not what builds a long-lasting firm. And if more entrepreneurs understood that more clearly, they could actually, from step one, design their plan, what they're building, how they're rolling out, how they build a business, how they build an organization, in a way that's more robust to international competition.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose don't need to go on a tangent here, but an extreme example could be VinFast, which I know is not a startup, although I do see it referred to that sometimes, but it kind of went into the U.S. I mean, granted, there were some market headwinds, but seemingly not having a great strategy for how to penetrate an extremely competitive market. So anyway, again, a larger example than probably what you're talking about, but relative at least. And on your first point, I mean, I don't think there's a lack of ambition generally in Vietnam, but why do you think some entrepreneurs might be content with, again, there's nothing wrong with $100 million business, but with that as opposed to something larger?
Each entrepreneur may have their own reason for it, so I don't want to generalize too much, but I would speculate maybe two main reasons. One may be that they need to see more examples of it. I mean, 4 unicorns is great. It's 4 more than there were 10 years ago, right? But they're recent. They haven't finished their journey, and so on. But seeing those 4 finish their journey to say public company, and then seeing another dozen behind them, I think would give folks a lot more belief capital. So that's one. Two, probably just in terms of say socioeconomic conditions. Aiming big de facto generally means taking on more risk, and not everybody has the financial means to take that kind of risk. So, aiming smaller with the higher chance of success may make sense for folks who need to build that safety net first. Venture capital is supposed to make that risk less, where we put our own money on the line rather than making other people put the money on the line. But there's not necessarily enough going to the right things.
And speaking of unicorns, actually also exits, I mean, VNG, which is I believe one of the unicorns here, was planning to IPO. They've delayed that. I think there's a variety of reasons. I guess one of which could, not to keep going back to VinFast, but could potentially be their IPO experience in the States, where their stock skyrocketed and is now way, way below that high. Anyway, or is there an impact when one of those major companies kind of draws back on or pulls back on a big plan like that?
I guess we can take this in sequence. The VinFast IPO wasn't a true IPO. I mean, the percentage that was floated was tiny. So there was never going to be a sustained pricing as high, even remotely as high as it got at the start. So that was just an oddity to me, which nobody should draw generalizations from. And I'm glad, the markets are ruthless. They'll make their assessments. VNG has, unlike VinFast, has a larger and more robust actual business right now. They could IPO, I believe, but I suspect why they haven't, why they have pulled back on their efforts is just a disconnect in perspectives on price. As I understand, they were aiming for a couple billion on IPO, and the folks that may have been looking at the numbers and so on, may have been expecting something that was too far off. So either the company has to moderate, the management has to moderate their expectations, or they have to wait till their business grows to their expectations. Either way, personally, and this is not investment advice or what have you, but I believe an IPO of VNG will happen. And between kind of continued business evolution for them, as well as the opening of the IPO window globally, I would hope to see a successful IPO, however you define that, in the next 2 years or so.
So kind of, speaking of your experience here in the tech funding scene, what are some of the biggest, I realize this is a bit of a broad question, but what are some of the biggest changes you've seen in how startups and entrepreneurs approach their business in Vietnam?
Yeah, that's quite a broad question. I'm going to answer indirectly, which is to say, I've been on this venture journey for about 10 years now. And a few years before that, when I got started looking at the space, I saw a space I didn't see an ecosystem. I saw a small handful of entrepreneurs working on their own with almost no support network, very little funding, and so on. And so by the very little funding, I mean, so let me be more specific. Back in, say, the 2010 to 2013, 2014 period, there was less than $100 million of venture financing going to startups in Vietnam each year. Fast forward, say, 5-6 years, and that became, at the peak, $1 billion of venture financing. So that shows how much the ecosystem got started and started to mature. Now, where are things at the moment? A lot more folks getting digital businesses started, a lot more diversity. I would say the average quality of the founding talent, the average quality of the tech talent is much better than it was 10 years ago and is continuing to evolve. I think there are more outlier founders now than there were 10, 15 years ago. And I think across both outlier founders and, say, next tier founders, they are more aware of what the startup journey is. So that's all great. Where I think needs to catch up, as much as I talked earlier about, hey, we need a deeper and broader venture talent, I actually think part of it as well is the venture capital pool needs to be deeper and more sophisticated. It's funny to say it's funny to hear when I say it out loud. But my colleague Ben and I, we've been working together, like I said, since 2014, 2015. We are the most experienced active GP team here in Vietnam in early stage venture, which is astounding. Like less than a decade of experience, and that makes us the most experienced. So other teams here have gotten started over the last few years, and they're going through their early learnings. So mistakes are made and so on and so forth. But as the coming years pass, then I think everybody will become, better at the craft and better able to support founders. And I think that'll be important for the long-term success of this ecosystem.
And on the VC side, I mean, how frequent or not is co-financing? Maybe a Vietnam-based VC putting in money with a Sequoia type, not Sequoia specifically, but like a foreign-based VC firm.
Yeah, I mean, it's often the case that there's a Vietnamese investor and an international investor, and that can help bridge things in the interim. But I would say the international investor is coming in because they're relying on the local investor to do certain diligence, make certain decisions, and so on. And so to the extent that the local investor gets it right or wrong, often determines will the company be able to progress 1 or 2 stages down the line. Fortunately, sometimes we are right, sometimes we are wrong, and I think that's just the nature of the business, and we have to learn as we go.
And kind of speaking of the near future, I know obviously nobody can predict the future, but you mentioned at the start that you think this funding downturn is maybe hopefully reached the bottom. Where do you see funding in the tech sector going over the next couple of years or so?
Yeah, so we've hit the bottom, but I wouldn't say we are in full recovery yet. I think it'll take another 1 or 2 years to really see strong forward momentum. There are probably still a couple of companies that are facing challenges and they need to shake out one way or the other, either find their next financing or merge or something like that. There are also some near-term challenges with regards to what's happening in Hanoi right now with the anti-corruption campaign and leadership changes. And of course, there will be a leadership change on the regular 5-year cycle coming up. these things tend to slow down a lot of economic activity to a degree. So I expect, that'll drag a little bit.
Yeah.
But within 2 years or so, both of these factors should be tapering down. Presumably, U.S. interest rates will have come down, currently expected later this year or else early next year. And as I said at the start of this conversation, the effects tend to lag by 1 to 2 years. So we should see the effects in Vietnam, say, 2 years from now, the positive effects in terms of capital formation. So all these things should come together to make for a more robust startup and venture climate.
And I guess kind of closing question. I mean, I obviously I know you can't give away any like proprietary information or anything, but are there any solutions or startups maybe bubbling away here that might surprise people in terms of, their approach or what they're working on?
Yeah, I think I answered that a little earlier, actually. And then as I think about the question here, it's a little hard for me to answer because not much surprises me anymore. If you asked me that like 5 or 10 years ago, I probably would have given you a different answer. But at this point, just the diversity of the entrepreneurship that's happening, the ability for outlier founders to raise capital from global marquee investors to expand to other markets, it's well exceeded my expectations. I'll give you a more specific observation. When I did my very first deck for trying to raise a little test fund back in late 2014, I modeled out, okay, I'll invest in like 20 companies and maybe a few of those will hit our winning outcomes. And the winning outcome I defined as reaching a $20 to $50 million valuation. That was the height of success that I saw for startups at that time. Obviously, that's not very interesting to international investors, but more importantly for why I'm sharing that is like that was way too constrained, and we have seen companies grow well beyond that, and that actually informs, I guess, the Q&A we had a little while ago about why are Vietnamese entrepreneurs not aiming as high as they could, and seeing examples might break that open. That's what happened with me individually, right? So, yeah. So, sorry, that's a long-winded answer to say not much surprises me. I think folks outside of Vietnam may be surprised that some great companies in AI and robotics will be coming from Vietnam in short order.
Cool. That'll be very exciting. I know it's been a kind of a tough couple of years for the sector, but still, a lot of interesting stuff happening. I'm personally fascinated by the electric mobility startups here. Eddie, thanks so much for coming on and talking through some of this. We'll have to have you back on at some point in the future when, hopefully when things pick up a bit. Not that it's not exciting anyway.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me. And I think there'll be some exciting stories. Be happy to pop back over about.
Awesome. Thanks again. That's it for this week's episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform, and see you next week.